Two Ukrainians were surrounded by Russian soldiers on a farm destroyed by artillery. The men found themselves cornered by 5 enemies. It was an event that happened long before the invasion of Kursk, but it was directly related. The lives of the men hit by the drones were shaped by orders from generals. Young recruits in Kursk were captured or killed after seeing these instruments of war enter their bunkers. The Russians had to deal with old decisions to position their artillery and finally stop some of the enemy's advances. Entire columns were hit, throwing vehicles off the road. Young men on both sides were dying or having their lives destroyed, changed forever by the battles at Kursk. The conflict in Ukraine was becoming a contest of who would wear out faster. In the recent offensives, the Russians had advanced toward Donetsk in the past few months. Their daily gains were impressive. The main strategy was to move toward Pokrovsk to cut off the Ukrainian supply line. Only at the beginning of September did the Ukrainians finally manage to stop some of the Russian gains. The same happened near the village of New York, which was taken by the Russians in August. In the advances toward Toretsk, this allowed troops who were about to be surrounded to get some relief. Meanwhile, the situation in Volhyda was getting worse by the day. After 2 years of defending against elite Russian troops, the invasion of Kursk should have pushed those advancing Russian troops back. To defend his own nation's territory, Putin didn't think it was necessary. Some groups even moved there, but apparently nothing essential. According to the Ukrainian commander-in-chief Alexander Syrsk, at least 30,000 troops had been diverted from Donetsk and Zaporizhia. Syrsk outlined the main objectives of the operation: to prevent Russia from using Kursk as a launching base for a new offensive, to divert Moscow's forces from other areas, create a security zone, prevent cross-border shelling of civilian targets, capture prisoners of war, and boost the morale of Ukrainian troops and the nation as a whole. According to Zelensky, the Kursk strategy was part of an ambitious plan for victory. And it was one of the factors that had prevented advances toward Pokrovsk for more than 6 days in September, something that seemed minor but had a great impact when considering the speed and efficiency of Russian gains. Putin stated that the Ukrainian offensive in the Russian region of Kursk had no effect, and that by moving well-prepared units to Kursk from other places, Ukraine made Moscow's advance in Donbass faster. The battlefields remained filled with blood, while politicians made statements about the results of their soldiers and the strategies of their generals. Young Ukrainians like Alexander Baratey advanced through Kursk, while Russian families with a military tradition had both father and son in the war, as was the case with Evgeny and Arseny Okremenko. In this last case, the story of these men connected Kharkiv and Kursk in a way that explained part of what happened in both oblasts. While they were fighting, their families and so many others suffered as they waited for news or when they experienced the heat of war close to home. Evgeny Okremenko was the son of military personnel, born in 1978, and he was proud of his family tradition. He happily began serving in the motorized infantry forces of the Central Military District. Later, he rose through the ranks until he became a commander in the 69th Motorized Rifle Division. Part of the 6th Combined Arms Army of the Western Military District ended up being responsible for the fighting in Kharkiv, mainly in the Kupiansk and Sinkivka regions. Some say he also organized the defenses at the borders, proud to have his sons serving in the region. The mortar teams of the 138th Brigade, subordinate to the 69th under Okremenko's command, worked against the Ukrainian forces. The soldiers carried the heavy shells to load them into the launch tubes. The impact of the shots shook the trees and the lives of the Ukrainians. Okremenko's troops managed to reach Sinkivka, where they began persistent assaults. In one of these, the Russians advanced in BMPs to try to take the village, which had fewer than 400 residents before the war. In 2023, the armored vehicles moved under the December snow and the smoke from the bombings, while javelins from the 30th Mechanized Brigade flew from Ukrainian positions, landing on the vehicles full of soldiers. The bodies of the dead rolled to the ground, while the living jumped onto the snow seeking shelter. The smoldering remains of armored vehicles began to litter the fields. The Russians crowded into the abandoned trenches, many of them young, desperate to survive. This clustering only made it easier for the drones to drop grenades. The first one knocked some sense into them. Those still able to run did, but the wounded became targets of new attacks that separated them from their limbs. That was a terrible winter for Okremenko, who sent more soldiers to the attack, hoping for better news. At one point, Russian squads managed to surround 2 Ukrainians from the 30th Brigade in a destroyed farm on the outskirts of Sinkivka. The explosions from the grenades and the AKS gunfire made 3 of them run to take cover in the craters left by the artillery. 2 still tried to maintain the siege, circling the destroyed house to find an opening to kill the enemies. Surrounded, they exchanged gunfire with the Ukrainians, and a grenade flew in response, exploding behind them. The fragments, massaging and warming his back, destroyed the courage of one of the Russians, who ran for cover. The other, alone and already out of ammunition, looked for the same cover. Seeing the shots whizzing over their heads, the other 3 allies tried to keep their heads down. In the same way, the Ukrainians kept repositioning themselves, and their projectiles hit the ground, tearing chunks out of the frozen earth. One of the Russians was hit, bleeding slowly onto the dark earth, while another tried to move away, but the gunfire was still relentless. One of the Ukrainians raised his arm and threw the grenade forcefully. It spun through the air until it fell into the Russian's hole, unleashing a wave of death that closed both their eyes. The Russian, who was farther back, began to crawl away, taking advantage of the distraction caused by his still living comrade. Farther ahead, there was the despair of one lying next to a corpse and the hope of another, seeing the opportunity to run. More. A grenade exploded on the frozen ground, with one Russian cornered and the other fleeing. The Ukrainians left their defensive positions to finish off the enemies. The projectiles pierced the man's skin, causing a soldier's blood to flow. Terrified in his last minutes of combat, the survivor went back to his superiors to report yet another Russian disaster. In that village where one of their BMPs and 4 corpses lay, Okremenko listened to the news, thinking about what he would report to the Kremlin and to the command of the 6th Combined Arms Army. That winter, when the summer of 2024 arrived, months later, he was reorganizing the 69th for the new battles. Their vehicles rolled over the mud-covered terrain, up to an excellent position, bombarding the Ukrainians inside Sinkivka. As if it wasn't enough that the village kept resisting, Okremenko had to deal with the new offensive in northern Kharkiv at the beginning of May, where the 6th Combined Arms Army was fighting there. Part of his troops, more precisely the 138th Motorized Rifle Brigade, part of the 69th Division, gained confidence with success in the first attacks. Then Ukrainians fought back. Okremenko saw his men fall under attacks from Kiev's drones, collapsing when the kamikazes of the 14th Brigade stormed their hideouts. Russian vehicles were chased across the fields, burning with the bodies of young soldiers inside. During the night, the pursuit continued. Okremenko was aware of reports of armored transport vehicles and artillery weapons being destroyed by drones. That summer, he himself was consumed by one of those attacks. The commander left behind a legacy with few stories of victories. One of his mistakes, according to a source, was parking part of the 138th on the border of the Kursk region. Among these men were many recruits, including his son Arsen, the 22-year-old Okremenko. Alexander Baratay didn't even know about the existence of Arsen Kremenko. What he knew was his mission, something he had just learned as part of the 82nd Separate Assault Brigade. His mission was to invade Russian territory in a way the world did not expect. That's how he advanced with the men of his battalion, their Cossack vehicles attacking groups of recruits who barely knew what to do in the face of so much fire. The young Russians were saved when the 810th Naval Infantry Guards Brigade intervened. It was their gunfire that set the Ukrainian armored vehicles on fire or knocked them off the road. Alexander quickly got out of the vehicles and looked for shelter until reinforcements or rescue arrived. Arsen, on the other side, was relieved to see that the Russian troops began to reorganize. He was beginning to understand what kind of war his father had died in. His easy military service was now disturbed by the sound of bombs exploding within his nation. It was lucky when the MSTAB teams made noise. The 152 mm howitzer inflicted even more fear and death on the Ukrainians who were attacking. In the second week of the invasion, planes took off while Arsen wondered when the recruits would be replaced by more experienced troops. He was hopeful since the Su-34S were already flying over the new front lines and dropping high-explosive aerial bombs on the invaders. Then a harsher action would come. The Ukrainians were already advancing to the point that their presence was recorded north of Sudza, in the village of Kremjanoi. The MLRs were deployed to stop this advance. The planes also dropped their bombs in the forests where the enemies were hiding. The Lancet drones made their dives to silence the guns of the Ukrainian tanks. The problem was that reports kept coming in about Kyiv's brigades at different locations. They consistently moved in the direction of Korenevo. Forces were being sent to protect the villages, but the Ukrainians imposed artillery fire on the equipment being transported. Many were hit, which left the fire signaling the defeat of these units in the forests of Kursk. Arsen didn't have his father's authority to get him out of that hell. He saw the messages showing how many recruits had died or been captured, and the stories about the Ukrainians getting closer and closer to their position, with no one coming to replace him. When the drones started descending on the combat post, the explosions left everyone scared. It's one thing to see it on your phone, it's another to feel how a tank shakes. Under the impact of the drone, the equipment disappeared or was twisted in the middle of the smoke. The buildings were worthless. In the midst of the violence of the attack, there was no hiding place that could conceal the men. The drones came in everywhere, showing their presence in the form of fire. Whoever was out in the open ended up feeling the impact directly on their skin. Arsen disappeared in one of these attacks. For days, his mother waited for his name to appear on the list of captives. But then the cold and dry message arrived that her son had perished. It was one more soul forever waiting at the borders of Russia in Kursk. The Ukrainian Alexander Baratay was unaware of this, much less of Arsen's mother's suffering. Now, without a son and without a husband lost to the violence of war, Alexander knew he had to continue his life. He was on the edge repeatedly. Born in 1997, he was a father and had to return home. His daughter and wife were not happy at all. When he was drafted in May 2024, he was trained, and from being an electrician, he ended up as a soldier. On that mission to invade Kursk, he was with the men of the 82nd Brigade who advanced north. One of their main targets was Korenevo. The mission was not easy. The tanks kept firing, trying to soften up the Russians. Korenevo was well protected. Ukrainian tanks sent for the attack were quickly intercepted by drones. It was hard to make progress when high-explosive aerial 3,000 bombs were falling in the forests where they were hiding, detonating everything alive within hundreds of meters. Russian weapons were constantly being prepared to try to stop anything that moved. Under orders from Kyiv, the Hyacinth S unleashed 152 millimeters of fury against the Ukrainian advances. The drone pilots had to find him to clear the way, so the columns wouldn't be disturbed. The equipment and one of its operators were destroyed in the fire. In the middle of the forest, Ukrainian war machines helped fill the Russian-controlled woods with fire. The Sinkivka VM-8 launched thermobaric projectiles to set the men's bodies on fire, leaving their charred corpses inside the trenches or next to destroyed equipment. The Russian troops, who tried a quick move with their ATGMs, were caught by drones in the middle of the road. The way to Kurnevo was opened. Little by little, the Ukrainians entered the city, but it was still difficult to advance. One strategy was to try a flanking maneuver in the direction of Sinkivka. Alexander moved forward with the battalion, clearing the way and pushing the opponents back. A Russian who tried to leave the area using a motorcycle was chased by the drones. A swarm followed him, and the first one got so close to the motorcycle that the soldier, desperate, fell at the side of the road. He got up without feeling the pain from the fall, driven only by the will to survive, and the drones circled him, dodging the shots. Dakar, the Russian, stumbled in the midst of despair and took the blast. His burned remains were filmed by another drone from the swarm. Alexander's squad managed to reach a village where they sought shelter in a house. Before advancing towards Sinkivka, they didn't notice the Russian drone plotting their death with the kamikazes. The threat descended upon the house. The wave of fire swept through the rooms, taking the life of Alexander Sinkivka. It won't be taken until early September 2024. Parts of Kurnevo that had been captured were lost around that same time, which happened with the column starting advancing strongly towards Snagost. On September 10th, the 51st Airborne Guards Regiment set the tracks of their equipment to crush the earth and their engines to roar toward the settlement. The machines left the roads for the fields to avoid the mines. Their cannons thundered against the Osmian forces. Smoke and dust rose, fleeing between the houses, destroying the buildings, searching for the enemy lives they intended to take. They took advantage of the fact that the Ukrainians hadn't had time to improve their defenses. The projectiles flew through Snagost, imposing the violence of war even more firmly within the Russian nation. The pieces of destruction were beginning to be assembled to form the puzzle of ruins that illustrated the conflict. The violent attack surrounded some of the Ukrainian soldiers, forcing them to surrender. The men raised their hands in front of the Kremlin's rifles, surprised at the moment when the columns invaded the settlement. When their task was to attack Kurnevo and their leaders had not given orders to improve the defenses, the Russians managed to position themselves within part of the Ukrainian lines, pushing the enemy troops away from Kurnevo. The flag was raised in the village at the same time as new reports began to arrive from the west. This Russian counteroffensive began with renewed spirit, with the Kremlin's forces charging forward with their tanks toward Gordievka and Ivnezapnoye. Apparently these defenses have been retaken. During the fighting, tanks from the 155th Marine Brigade fired at the enemies, driving them away from the settlements in the region. The pressure against the Ukrainians was now coming from Kurnevo in the north and also from Grushkovo in the west. These Russian advances did not happen without resistance. The 501st Ukrainian Marine Battalion was there when the Russian Marines from the 155th landed to try to advance even further. The drones roamed the sky, watching these troops on the roads while the enemies moved through the grass. The protection of the railway line became a focal point in the disputes between Russians and Ukrainians. The Kremlin's Marines ended up bunching together and getting distracted, giving the kamikaze drone an opportunity to come down among them. One of the men ran away in terror, but the other was hit squarely in the back. Shrapnel flew among the Russians. The survivors retreated with their bodies weighed down by injuries and their minds shaken, leaving their friends' bodies behind. Part of the Russian attacks took place in Komarovka to create a new breakthrough and pull Ukrainian troops from the north. During an attack that destroyed part of the Ukrainian advance, a drone found a mine-resistant ambush protected, abandoned by Kiev's soldiers. The kamikaze made sure to eliminate any possibility of it being used again. Later, that vehicle was burning on the road while other threats loomed over the Ukrainians. The multi-purpose tracked light armored vehicle was an armored personnel carrier developed by the Soviets in the 1960s and was Ukrainian. The kamikaze took care of eliminating the Ukrainian soldiers started to copy the article, described what we pressed. Museu Pustedo de Ofta. Inconsistencies. Increasing in recent months, they still didn't come close to the frequency of use of the UAVs, but they were bombs with good accuracy, aiming to break Russian resistance. In Komarovka, the explosions shattered walls and soldiers' bodies, burying so many men in the soil of their own nation. Shortly after, there was news that this 155th offensive would have to deal with another problem. The Ukrainians crossed the Kursk border right in their rear, indicating that they would have to deal with two fronts of combat. The maps disputed the gains and losses of both sides, marking in different colors the places where the bodies of young men were resting. The lines changing on the screens of war observers or strategists. They never showed the real truth. They signified each daily change, the discouraged looks on days when there were no changes in the front lines, but they didn't detect that even this stagnation meant significant advances in the cycle of violence, life and death that existed in the war.